If you're a pastor and you're feeling a bit overworked or stressed, or maybe even feel like you're heading towards burnout, then this video is for you.
Anybody is positioned to actually change a culture by mobilizing people in all of those spheres of influence in the community. It's the church.
I'm really excited today to have a special guest on my channel, Derek Sanford, the pastor of Grace Church in Erie, Pennsylvania, and also the author of Untapped Church. This will be a great opportunity to think about ways you might tap resources in your church that you haven't thought about in terms of volunteer leadership.
Believe that it's possible. So believe that people will say yes when you ask them to do something important.
Derek, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, great to be here, John. Thanks so much for having me on. I totally resonate with what you just said. As I travel around and see pastors, I think that's one of those just kind of universal aches of just going, man, there's more to do than I got people to do, and I'm getting burnout trying to do it myself. And I just really feel like we've been able to accomplish more ministry than I ever thought possible by reaching out to people that had capacity. So I'm excited to be here to talk about that today.
Yeah, and I am so excited to share your story. I think it's always interesting how networks work. I recently interviewed Dale Sellers of 95 Networks for my YouTube channel, and I was on his podcast as well. And as soon as he heard about the Nehemiah Way, he said, "I've got to introduce you to Derek Sanford." This is like if you imagine this in real life, and he just described how you have done such a good job of, I think it's all really just trusting God to bring the leaders to you, but giving people space to step up and say, "Hey, I'll be a leader, even if I'm not paid staff, and even be part of the org structure." And so I'm really excited to unpack that with you today.
Yeah, great. Me too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, why don't we start with tell us about Grace Church? Like, give us a little bit of the backstory there and a little bit of your story, because I think that's really important to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Grace is a phenomenal church. I actually went to youth ministry at Grace Church back in my high school days. And so we moved to this town when I was in 9th grade, and my family started going to this church. And lo and behold, this is where God called me back to. I just celebrated 30 years as a pastor. My predecessor was here at Grace for 32 years before me. And so we've had, between the two of us, a long run, which I'm really, really proud of and happy about. But Grace, we're located up in Erie, Pennsylvania, so northwest corner of Pennsylvania, right on Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. And we're a multi-site church, have 3 locations, and we're an old church. And so Grace was founded in 1895 in downtown Erie. The Swedish Baptist Church was kind of our origins. And so 19 immigrants started a house church downtown. And so I like to say we're an old church, but we don't act our age. So we've grown a lot since then. We're very, kind of spread out, more of a suburban church at this point. But Erie's a blue collar town, and kind of like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Cleveland. You kind of imagine that. We're actually right in the middle of those 3 cities, about 90 miles from each one. And so kind of a similar vibe, lots of snow. Right on the lake, and whatever happened to Buffalo happened to us a half hour earlier, kind of thing. But anyway, I love our church so much, and so proud of our folks. And a huge part of our story was just naming the fact that our people are our greatest resource. And so I think for pastors, just to come to grips with that of like, our youth ministry is great, or our worship is great, or our buildings are great, or whatever. The thing that finally kind of settled in on me and started us on this new trajectory was just our people are our greatest resource. And what God knows how to build churches. And so what are we supposed to do with the people that God's brought our way, and how are we supposed to leverage them for kingdom purposes? And that's the journey we've been on through most of my ministry.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I think, one thing that struck me as I was getting familiar with and getting to know your ministry is nothing I encountered would have made me think for a second, this is a church that's been around for, right. centuries, like it just, like you say, you don't act your age. And I think that's probably something that resonates with a lot of younger pastors who are kind of stepping into ministries that are, long standing, decades or centuries. And, what does it take to, almost bring that congregation and that culture and all those things, the best of it, but also just recognizing it's, there's a transformation that God's going to do to be able to move that forward into the future. I think that's what will really resonate with a lot of leaders.
Yeah, and obviously, I think we need to. I think one of the big mistakes churches make often is trying to be someone they're not, and so I think you really have to begin with who has God brought us. Even if you have a vision to move to a different place, obviously there's a change management side of that. But I think the just philosophically, you start with who has God brought us? Like, who are the people here, and how can we build on that, even if the vision's taking us in a different direction. We've been slow and steady in that way for lots of years now.
Yeah. Well, and maybe just to take a little bit of a side trail, just multi-site, I think there's been, a lot of different ways, growth has happened in churches, and, kind of the mega church movement was, let's just make as big a church as possible and keep buying land and building a bigger building. But multi-site, I remember Brad House did so much to kind of, to really like look at what are models to do this, where you don't lose that local culture. And at the same time, you kind of have the benefit of the organization that's clearly growing. What were some of the dynamics of moving to multi-site, and what are some of the things that make that unique and valuable and different maybe than, say, a church that just keeps getting more and more massive in one place?
Yeah, and that was really the thing. I mean, we started to see that we were drawing from a further and further reach, and it's like that's great, but also with that comes engagement problems and involvement problems, and the church becomes a destination and not a body. And so, we're just saying, hey, we don't want our church to be a destination. We want to be a place where people can get involved in the local community. And so, yeah, that was really our thing. We weren't necessarily like busting at the seams. We didn't do multi-site because of space problems. We did it more for missional reasons, to say we want people to be engaged closer to where they live. And so we just started saying, hey, where are the most people coming from? We did a zip code search of our database, and where the most people coming from. We found that a whole bunch of families were coming from about 20 miles, down the road. And so we decided to start a location there. And so I just think it helps people to, the way I think about multi-site is I think it gives you the benefits of both a big church and a small church. So, the big church stuff, you've got some of the resources, you've got some of the people power, of a larger congregation. You've got for us, a reputation in the community that was longstanding. But then you also get some of the smaller church benefits as well. It's a little bit more intimate. It's localized. People are involved and engaged in the community. And so we've really found it to be a great model. Although we haven't multiplied a ton, COVID kind of slowed us down there on that front. And I'm kind of glad it did, because we've taken a bit of a different direction. But we do have a few sites right now, and we have no intention of kind of going any different direction in terms of the sites that we have. But when we look at multiplication for the future, I think we're going to be thinking a little differently about that.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, I look forward to digging into that shortly, because I know you have some really, really powerful and interesting vision. Before we go there, though, let's talk a little bit about your org structure, because I think this is one of the things that Dale pointed out to me that I thought was so interesting. I remember when I first time I looked at the Grace site and I started scrolling, I was getting a finger cramp from all the scrolling and scrolling. But your staff is not all paid staff. So talk about leadership and the org structure and just some things like that, because that's, I think, a really, really unique thing about Grace.
Yeah. So we hit a moment, it was about back in 2011 or so, where we just recognized that I think most pastors face this. We got more ministry that we believe God is calling us to do than we have paid staff to do it. And so that leads to a lot of angst and anxiety and going, a lot of long hours, because a lot of, we've got a decision point there. Am I just going to do it all myself? Am I going to burn out our existing staff? Like, how are we going to accomplish these things that we believe God's called us to? And, we just at that time said, what if there are high capacity people in our congregation that could lead major ministries, that could lead new initiatives, that could lead, systems, system deployment or whatever, that don't need a paycheck or don't maybe want a paycheck. And so we started looking like, what are our growth engines? What are the things that we believe God's called us to do that we can't currently do because of of our current staff capacity? And who are some people in our congregation that may have capacity more than they're giving? Yeah. And we just matched up those two lists and made some big asks to those people and just said, hey, would you consider, and we invited them at the time, just said, would you consider coming onto our staff as an unpaid volunteer? Here's the number of hours it would take. Here's the job description. We're going to treat you just like we would treat a staff person. And I think there was about 6 or 7 of those in that first wave of asks. And to my incredible surprise, they all said yes. 100% of them said, yes, I will do that. And that ignited a fire. And so, you mentioned my book. I wrote a book called Untapped Church. That word untapped just
right
means, oh, there we go. A little plug. The word untapped means available but not used. And so I just became convinced at the time that was what held us back. And more convinced than ever that across churches across America, across the world even, that there is untapped potential sitting in people's congregations, that there are people who are available but not used. And so, right now, still, we're at about 2/3 of our staff. When we have our full staff meetings, about 2/3 of the people in the room are not paid. They're volunteers, and about 1/3 of those paid staff. And, some of the downstream effect of that, we started to blur the lines of paid and unpaid. We had to move some meetings around so that people who had other jobs could attend staff meetings. And it was a little burden initially on our paid staff. But once I think our paid staff caught the vision for what's possible, and that this one extra evening per week was going to mean 2 more evenings home, because we're raising up people who are going to share the ministry in such a way that suddenly we began to see, the potential of all of this. And I'll tell you one quick thing. I'll throw it back to you. But one of the aha moments for me that we had something unusual and special. I walked into a staff meeting of our largest location. So our largest location is in McCain, about 1,000-person church. And I walked into a staff meeting one night, and there was about 20 people in there. So you've got the site pastor, the campus pastor, the kids person, the youth person, the guest experience, all the worship, all the way around, all the positions. And looked around the room. And as I'm scanning the room, listening to the site pastor lead this meeting, I realized that 19 and a half of those people were unpaid. We had a part-time paid worship person, was the only person receiving any kind of financial, remuneration from the church in that room. And so our largest location was being led by essentially an entirely volunteer staff. And so, it was kind of at that point, I'm like, I bet that's kind of unusual. And we should probably think about what are we doing? How do we recreate that more and all that? So.
Yeah. Well, and I've talked to people that were, running larger ministries that just said the idea of having someone on staff that wasn't a paid staff person would be, just wouldn't work. And, it's like, hearing your story, it's like, wow, that is really, truly, almost what I would envision the early church, everybody was, was a pastor, they were part of the church, they were doing their work, and they're, part of this every day. And it just seems like that's so much more aligned with what you would see in the Bible, even though it's a large church and complex.
Yeah. And I want to be clear. I mean, I'm not against paying staff. I mean, I think that's still a part of what the church can and should do even these days. But I do think that in some ways we've given up on this idea that, people will do ministry because they're called by God to do ministry, whether there's a paycheck attached to it or not.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we can reclaim, in our time.
Yeah. Well, and I think about, one of the kind of topics that is always like hard to talk about in church is money and asking for money. Pastors always feel a little reluctant to be like pushing for giving. And yet, most churches, half the people don't give at all or give very little, or even more than that. And, but in some ways, the thing that I don't personally hear a lot of people asking for is time.
Yeah.
And if I had a hypothesis, it would be most people in churches, most congregants in churches would be more likely to write a check, so to speak. I mean, it's probably digital at this point, but, then it would be to commit time was, we only have 168 hours every week. It's like, what would it take to commit 1 or 5 or 10 of those hours? And yet, it's like, what more valuable thing could we give to the kingdom?
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
then the way I talk about it is, we've fallen back into, a two-tier system. So it's an Old Testament system where, you had the priesthood, then you had everybody else. And the priesthood, there was clothes only they could wear, prayers only they could pray, places only they could go. And then
yeah,
there was everyone else. And Jesus, when he came, he didn't do away with the priesthood. He gave it to everybody.
yeah,
And so everyone in our congregations is, and I know the term has been priesthood of all believers. For Protestant audiences, I call it the pastorhood of all believers because priest
yeah,
means something different to us. But it's like, unfortunately, the church in the West has fallen back into that two-track system that was never Jesus's vision,
yeah,
where most churches are set up where the people come and they spectate and they, if they're happy, put money in the plate. If they're upset, they write an email or whatever. But the idea is that, pastor, that's why we pay you.
mm,
That's why we pay you to do the ministry. Read the Bible, tell us what it means. Visit the sick, help the poor. Like that's what we pay you to do. And I just believe that two-track system was never in Jesus' mind about what the New Testament church was supposed to look like.
yeah, yeah. And if you look at the early church, it didn't look like that.
It didn't at
It
all.
was- yeah.
No.
So in reading the book, one of the things I stuck out, and you just mentioned it briefly, like, moving staff meetings to Monday nights, because you have people that are working full time and now they're also, involved. And what were some of the other things you did to kind of retool the almost the organizational processes
Yeah.
to make it more viable to have volunteer and really, just those leaders that are within the congregation?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the, and kind of the big term that I would put over this is we just tried to blur all the lines between paid and unpaid.
Yeah.
And so wherever those lines existed before, we just tried to do away with them. So yeah, there were some practical things that we did, but a lot of it started with language of just like, we're not going to say just a volunteer. We're not going to say, we're not going to put a little V next to people's names in parentheses when we list them on the website as part of our staff. They're just part of our staff. Like these are our leaders at our church. And so we want to blur and erase those lines that exist. We like to say that we wanted to give people responsibility that matched their capacity. And so if their capacity was big, we wanted to give them a responsibility that matched. And so, we at a time had a supervisor of our pastors was not paid. And so this person that was determining our pastors' vacation requests and salaries and all of that stuff was an unpaid volunteer, but his responsibility matched his capacity. This is what he did in the real world. And he was willing to do it for us for 20 hours a week to oversee our pastoral staff. And he was gifted at it and skilled at it. And so we allowed him to do it. So anyway, some of the other just really kind of practical things, we did move meetings around. That was a big deal. We tried to give people, if our paid staff wore a little badge on Sundays that, pinned onto their clothes, we just made sure that our volunteer staff had those as well. We business cards or, whatever it is, workstations, an email address with the church email. It's funny. One of our great high capacity leaders named Sarah, who's a volunteer leader here. She talks about the first time that she had to fill out a vacation request form as a volunteer. So she had to submit a vacation request to let us know that she was going away as a volunteer. And she actually said that was one of the first moments where she felt so affirmed in her role.
Yeah.
It wasn't a put off for her. It was just the opposite. It was her saying, I am so important to this organization that they need me to let them know when I'm going on vacation, even though I'm a volunteer.
That's
And so, even just simple things like that, paperwork kind of things, performance reviews, like all of that stuff, we just have tried to erase the lines.
So how does that work? Performance reviews, like how awkward is that? Like
It's
you're
not.
not really.
It's not anymore. It's so much a part of our culture. It's that everybody expects that if you have a role here that carries weight and responsibility, you're going to be evaluated on that, and we're going to have honest conversations about, like, the kingdom of God's too important for us, not to.
I love
And
that.
so yeah, but I do realize that it's been in our atmosphere for a decade, and so, or more than that. So it's definitely part of the culture here. And starting out, some of that stuff is a little bit awkward.
Yeah, I could see where early on, but it doesn't make, I love the way you said that. It's like, the kingdom of God's way too important to not, do the things we would do. Like,
Yeah,
this was on staff. I love the, just the blurring in the lines. I mean, those are like, all those things are, even some of the things like the name tag seems like a subtle thing, but
it's a
it,
big deal.
yeah, it really makes it clear that that's not really there's no difference between
Yeah,
this role and another.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so talk to me a little bit about like what it looks like now, because I think that was kind of like where it all began. And but what are some of the ministry outcomes? What are some things that are happening now that if you look back like 10, 15 years ago or whenever this started, like you would have never even imagined?
Yeah.
What are some of those things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I just think it's hard to even trace it back because there's so much ministry that has been attached to these folks that have stepped into these roles. I mean, it's just incredible. And so when I mean, the simplest answer is just to say that uh, an exponential increase in the amount of ministry that we've been able to accomplish. And I mean, I mentioned those early days where it was like 6 or 7 people that we recruited and said, "Hey, we think God's calling us to do this, but we can't do it because we don't have the paid staff to do it. Would you step in and do it?" And I look at some of those initiatives that we started there that are like going into their, 13th or 14th year in existence. Of one great example is Serve Erie. It's eventually become a nonprofit in our region, but we just, back in the day, we said, listen, we believe God is calling us to serve this community in incredible ways and to send our inclination was to say that we just have a proximity problem, that there are great Christians who want to serve God and help our community, but they don't come face to face with the needs of our community every day. And so what if we had a ministry that bridged that gap, that said, I'm going to get in touch with the nonprofits and the mayor and the people that are doing great things in our community but have incredible needs, and all of these Christians who are motivated to meet those needs but just don't know what to do. They don't know where to start. So we said, what if we could make that handshake happen and then step out of the way? And it was a ministry that we called Serve Erie. And Serve Erie has gone on, and I think we have 100 partners that help now with Serve Erie, other organizations that step in every time we do a Serve Erie event. There's colleges and businesses and everybody who are sending out volunteers like an army into our community. Well, that ministry is just one example of something that started as a result of an unpaid volunteer who we reached out to in those early days and said, we think God wants us to do this, but we don't have the capacity to pull it off. Could you lead this ministry? And the downstream effects of that are unbelievable. I couldn't even put a number on it, a value on it, because of all the work that's been done as a result of that one little seed. So that's just one simple example.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, and so it sounds like, I mean, you mentioned one of your whole sites is at least at one point was almost
At one
completely
point.
run
Yeah.
by volunteer leaders.
Yeah.
You have a community outreach
Yeah.
engagement ministry. What are some others that you mentioned there were 6 or 7 initially? What are some others that are really
Yeah, I mean, I think, anytime we've needed to start new service, I really think there are categories that we always look at to say, if we're going to expand right now, and I realize, I use the word growth engine in the book. It may be a little bit of a misnomer because sometimes what a church needs is not growth. What it needs is health.
Mm,
And so but when I think about that, I think, is there a new initiative that God's called us to start that we don't have the bandwidth to pull off? Is there
yeah,
a system that needs fixed? Because sometimes the system itself. So I'll give you another example, like the way that we do baptisms now, and have a platform for baptisms and a methodology for the way that we do baptisms. I mean, we see hundreds of people get baptized every year as a result of our church. Well, that baptism ministry was one that had a crappy system. Nobody knew how to do it. Nobody knew how often we were doing it. There was no process for people coming in. There was no follow-up process for people going out. And that was one of those things early on that we said, you know what, we need somebody to own the baptism process. So this is not a new ministry. This is not an earth-shattering thing that's happening out there. This is
yeah,
just going, we've got a system that we need to make more efficient and effective. And if we can, we believe there's going to be incredible downstream effect. But that's a ministry that's just been run by volunteers ever since. our finance ministry, and the way that it exists right now. Now, right now, we do that with a partner. But for years, we had these incredible financial minds from local companies who would come in, recently retired folks or whatever, who would come in and run our financial ministry of a pretty big church with pretty big numbers, and do it as volunteers. So even, sometimes people will say, well, man, aren't there some roles that you really need a paid person in because of the accountability and such? And I do think there's some wisdom to that. But man, we've kind of, we've shored up our intake process and go, man, if this person is trustworthy and if they check some boxes, even if they're not paid, we're going to trust them with some really big stuff. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Well, so I want to double click a little bit on what you said about growth versus health.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about what your definitions are of each, and when is it time to grow, and when is it time to back up and look at health?
Yeah, I think that's an art question and not a science question. Just because the way that we've described it around here is it does feel like the pendulum on a clock that, we'll, and part of it's just like an instinct thing, I think, that comes with leadership and pastoral ministry, of just going, hey, we've really put a lot of effort right now on evangelism and getting out there and doing service projects and getting outside our walls and inviting people in and doing baptisms and getting people saved. And then there comes this moment of like, holy crap, we better grow those people up a little bit. So it's like, pause this. We need to really put a lot of effort on this. And, and so we'll go into a health mode where we really need to ratchet up our systems and our initiatives on the health side of things and make sure that and then it does seem to just kind of go to swing back and forth a little bit based on the season. And so, I do kind of think that that's both are important. I think even with some of the initiatives that we're moving toward now, that they are probably less separate entities than I've thought that they were in the past. I think they're more like two sides of the same coin than two separate things. And so we're moving in that vein right now. But I do think that there's a leader instinct, a pastoral instinct that comes with, should we be reaching more people right now, or should we be growing up the people that we have right now? And I think there's strategies that go with each one of those decisions.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom in a little bit on growing up the people that are there. And this is, I've talked a lot about this, and it just seems to come up a lot of times in discussions with pastors, is just leadership development. What are some of the things you've done to really, rise up these leaders and to kind of bring them into the system and just develop the competency of leadership within the church?
Yeah. I mean, we've been really big on the, just kind of on the mentoring, apprentice kind of model, where I do, you watch and we talk about it. And then, I do and you help and we talk about it. And then you do and I help and then we talk about it. And then you do and I watch and then we talk about it. And then you do and someone else watches, and the system repeats. And so we've used that apprentice model for many years, and encourage people to kind of go through that relational process of raising up leaders. But we're also big believers in formal leadership training as well, and so we integrate a ton of leadership training into our normal rhythms as a staff. So whether those are all together, we do leadership training at every staff meeting. We do provide asynchronous stuff that people can access outside of those formal moments as they need it. I just know for me that on the job learning was always way more effective than learning beforehand and then going to do the job, because you forget half of what you learned as you're learning it. You don't remember why you're learning it. You know what I mean? But if you're learning it as you go, and so, we call that on-time training, that if we can provide on-time training for people, that when they experience the hunger for training or knowledge or some skill that they don't have, that we're there ready to help them attain that skill. And so that's been more of our approach than anything. We did start a leadership institute a couple of years ago, where we're partnering with some local Christian colleges, bringing in some professors to do some, deeper biblical and theological training and that sort of thing, because we did find that had become a lid for our culture. That people were stepping into roles that we were doing a good job on the ministry side of things, training them with some skills, practical skills, and that sort of thing. But their confidence was capped because of a lack of biblical training or theological training. And so we started to scratch that itch a few years ago and really try to fill in the gaps with some good biblical training. I would say also there's just some great easy resources out there. Like Right Now Media, we have a subscription to Right Now Media where it has training on every possible topic. And so even if we're not creating it, we can shoot somebody a Bible study on a certain topic or a skill study on whatever. We're also part of the leadership book summaries group. And so, they do, 10-page summaries of basically every great Christian related leadership book out there. And so we can do just a assignment of a book summary and tell me your 2 takeaways and let's talk, as a leader about that. And so anyway, those are just some informal and formal ways that we try to keep that pipeline going.
Yeah. So looking at that growth engine you've created at this point, what are some things in your vision? Like, what are you looking ahead at, and what are you hoping to now be able to employ and deploy this kind of engine, these individuals to do next?
Yeah, I think one of the regrets of my book, and really, it's hard to call it a regret of my whole ministry, but I probably would put it in that category, is that I feel like we had a false finish line, I'll call it, inside the walls of the church. And so we really made our model around this idea that, we want people to have responsibility that matches their capacity. And we kind of made the pinnacle of that journey come on staff of our church, inside the walls of our church, to keep our church running. And I think one of the visions for the future, we really are boiling it down to 2 things. We're saying we want to change the scorecard. We want to change the finish line. So we want to change the scorecard of what we're measuring as a church, and measuring more in discipleship measures versus nickels and noses and how many people attend and give. And we want to change that finish line from inside the walls of the church to outside the walls of the church. And the good news is I feel like we've got the infrastructure to really empower people to lead where they are. But I know this is kind of where the intersection comes with me and you and the Nehemiah way and what's happening there, and really kind of raising up leaders, where they are. But we've become very, very passionate. We're doing a whole humongous overhaul of this old church, and me as a 30-year-old, old dog learning new tricks of saying, we're moving from an assimilation, an attractional assimilation model to a missional multiplication model. And so instead of our focus being on, attend, connect, serve, which is what, most churches want to assimilate people. And so we have this funnel that says we want a bunch of people to attend. We're going to attract them from the highways and byways in the community. Come to our worship service on Sunday. And then hopefully some of you will get connected to a small group, and hopefully some of you then serve on a ministry team. And I feel like we've almost perfected that. We've said, not just serve on a ministry team, come onto our staff as an unpaid volunteer. And we're saying, really, when you look at the ministry of Jesus, he flipped that funnel. It wasn't attend, connect, serve. It was called, train, sent. He helped people figure out, what are you called to? I'm going to train you up. I'm going to send you out. And so we're really in the business right now of kind of flipping that funnel around and say, we want to help people find their calling. We want to help them to be trained up. And then we want to send them out to where they live, work, learn, and play, and live out their disciple-making calling outside the walls of the church.
Yeah, I love that. What are some examples of that? Like, how might that play out when it's kind of fully realized?
Yeah, I think we have I'll give you a specific example. So, the one that broke my heart. So we've got a businessman, for example, His name's Doug, and Doug came to me one day after church, and he said, I started my own construction company, been going for about 5 years. He said, I'm basically trying to run my company as a Christian business. He said, we build our core values around Christian principles. I'm doing Bible studies in the morning with any of my employees that want to attend. I really try to kind of see myself as a pastor of these, 50 employees or whatever, and their families and their wives and their children and their husbands. And I see myself as the pastor of these families and really trying to bless them. And then he said this, and every time I come to church and you talk about life group leaders or small group leaders, I feel guilty that I'm not leading a small group for the church. And I hang my head in shame in that moment and say, we've failed Doug, because Doug is leading a small group. In fact, he's leading about 10 of them through his company. Yeah. And he's leading a whole small group ministry. And we haven't counted it. We haven't had an imagination for what can the church do to come around Doug. We've only had an imagination for what can Doug do for us, and how can Doug help us build our ministry, versus how can we build Doug to be a minister exactly where he's at. And so, you think about the workplace, you think about the marketplace is one big one. You think about people who are running or working in nonprofits is another arena. You think about people who are called to their neighborhoods, who see themselves as a pastor of their parish, of their neighborhood. And we're just trying to flip the questions and go, listen, instead of asking, what can you do for the church? We're asking, what can the church do for you? How can we resource you? What if we thought of the Dougs of the world like we think about our site pastors, our location pastors, and thought of Doug's company as one of Grace Church's locations? How would we treat Doug differently if we thought of him that way, or if we thought of this nonprofit that one of our people is the executive director of as one of Grace Church's ministries? How would that flip how we engage them, how we think about them, what we invite them to, how we resource them, and so it's a total mind shift. And it's really messing with me, actually, after 30 years of doing it a different way, but I love it.
Well, it's just, and like you say, it's not the way the church usually approaches things, but wow, what a powerful vision. Yeah. And it really does seem a lot like what you saw Jesus do with his ministry. Think about, the 3 at the core, and the 12 disciples, and the 72 that were sent out. And, and I also see real parallel with, what happened in Nehemiah when he came in to really start to move things forward. He looked for those individuals that already had influence. They were business owners. They were community leaders. They were political leaders. They were religious leaders, but they had people surrounding them. A lot of times I call them like a serving circle. They were used to working together as a team. Yes. And he essentially empowered each one of those individuals to mobilize their team and go and do the work. Right. And it just really has a very similar flavor to it.
Yeah, it really does. And, there's been lots of writing about this, but Gabe Lyons is the one that wrote about this that got my attention. He talks about these 7 channels of cultural influence. And, they've been called different things, 7 mountains, there's all kind of names for it, but 7 channels of cultural influence. And it's like, business and the arts and media and politics and education and the church. And I'm probably missing 1 or 2. But there are these 7 channels, and basically the premise is, and this has been repeated through history, that if you can get leaders in those 7 channels of influence working in the same direction, even briefly, you can enact incredible cultural change. Wow. And so even in our lifetime, and not to bring up a controversial subject, but if you look at the LGBTQ community kind of thing, in our lifetime, that has gone from being one thing to being another thing in our culture. Yeah. And part of what happened is all 7 channels of the cultural influence kind of got together and pushed that forward in a fairly short amount of time. Yeah. And Lyons said something in his book about this that just has never left me. He said, the church is the only one of those 7 that convenes people from the other 6 every week.
Wow.
And so if anybody is positioned to actually change a culture by mobilizing people in all of those spheres of influence in the community, it's the church. because we have people coming together representing all of them every week. We're the only one that has an audience with
Right.
people from all of those things every single week, and we're not utilizing it. And it causes me to lose sleep at night.
Right. Right. So, one of the things I talk about a good bit in the Nehemiah way and others, just people problems, right? And, if you have a church, you got people problems because there's people there, right? What are some of the challenges you've run into? And I mean, maybe some of the things that like maybe specifically have come out of this model, and how have you worked through those?
Yeah. I'll tell you, it's going to sound way too simple. But we are working this thing at the ground level. And the biggest problem so far is an awareness problem, in that because we haven't had an imagination, people haven't had an imagination for their calling apart from church. And so there's a tethering of what people think being spiritual is to what happens on a Sunday morning. And so as I've been meeting with tons of business leaders, tons of nonprofit leaders, tons of neighborhood leaders, and just saying, one of the questions, I've got a little list of questions, but one of the questions that I'm asking them is, what does it look like for you to bring your faith into your workplace or into this sphere? And the most frequent answer that I'm getting, and I'm telling you, John, these are longtime Christians. These are people who have been Christians for 20 years, 30 years. The most frequent answer that I'm getting is, I never thought about it. I never considered it. And so we're in one of our coaching groups right now, and there's a business owner who's in that group. He's been leading a business for a long time Christian. He answered with that question, and so we're in that kind of like a little accountability group. And one of the guys says, "Well, what would it look like for you to think about it, to bring your faith into your workplace?" And he says, "Well, I'm known as a bit of a hothead in my business, and people are sometimes afraid to come to me because I tend to blow up and get impatient and blah, blah, blah." Yeah. And he said, maybe I could pray before somebody comes into my office to meet with me, pray for them and pray for the meeting, and pray that the Holy Spirit would help me have self-control and all these things. So everybody's like, yeah, that's great. Like, yeah, do that. And so he comes back the next week and he's like, I did it. And everybody's like, what happened? And he says, well, here's what happened. I prayed before they came in. They said something that kind of, I would have normally kind of blew up on, but I had prayed. I had invited God into this moment. And so instead I started just asking them some questions. And he said, this thing ends with them kind of opening up about something that was going on in their home life that was causing this issue at work, and they were having a family situation. I got to bless them in that family situation, all that kind of stuff. And he said it was incredible. He said, I just felt like I could have prayed for him. And they said, well, did you pray for him? And he's like, no, I didn't pray for him. Like, that's this week. And so, but I'm just thinking about these baby steps. It's so basic to go, what does it actually look like to enact your faith outside the walls of the church? And I'm embarrassed to say it in one sense, but that has been one of the biggest struggles, is just to get people to connect the dots between, this is who God made me to be. And the idea is not that I'm supposed to be that person for 1 hour on Sunday. I'm supposed to be that person for the other 6 days of the week, so that God can use me as a disciple maker.
Yeah. That's really, what's interesting, I'm hearing a lot of discipleship happening in what you're describing,
Sure.
and helping everyone to work through their sanctification. And it's just really interesting to hear how that plays out.
Yeah, we get these big ideas in our mind when a big word like discipleship is thrown around, and everybody has a picture of what that means and looks like. And it's 7 guys, knee to knee in a Starbucks on a Saturday morning at 4:30 a.m. and, working through deep theological matters. Man, I think it's simpler than that. I think it's asking good questions, encouraging people to take a step, holding them accountable, and then celebrating when they do. And I think that's discipleship.
Yeah, I love that. So if a younger pastor, someone's, maybe stepping into their first lead pastor scenario, or maybe they've just planted a church, or, they're in that early stage, and they're listening to this and saying, Wow, that's a really it's a radically different approach to ministry. It's also a radically different vision for ministry. What's some advice you'd give about if you were going to start from day one? What are some things you would do if you were going back to that moment to kind of move in this direction?
Yeah. I think one, a very foundational piece of advice I would give is to think volunteer before staff paid.
Mm.
Think volunteer before paid staff. And so when you're like, I have this idea, I have this new initiative, I have this system that needs fixed, before you think, who can I hire to do that? Because here's what happens as soon as your brain goes there, you are paralyzed until you hire that person. And
Mm.
so in your mind, you're just going, I can't do that until I hire that person. I can't do that until I hire that person. And I think about all the paralysis that happens because we get that fixed in our minds. So think volunteer before paid.
Mm.
The second thing, and again, very basic, but believe that it's possible. So believe that people will say yes when you ask them to do something important. And listen, how we ask people to step into these roles is very important. But a lot of pastors say no for people before they even ask them. So they're like, well, they're already busy with X, Y, and Z. So they would never say yes to this request for them to step into this big role without a paycheck. And I just tell pastors, you have to believe that it's possible. And the way you ask them is not the way that we normally ask people, which is, oh, it won't take any time. You'll be able to do this in your sleep. It'll take you no time at all. And we kind of soft sell this thing up front.
Yeah.
And leaders don't respond to that. Leaders don't respond. They're like, okay, well then have somebody else do that because my time's more valuable
Right.
than that.
Yeah.
Leaders want you to look them in the eye and say, this is a huge problem that we need solved. We haven't been able to solve it. We think you're the perfect person to help us solve it. And guess what? It's going to take your best time. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take your best energy, your best thinking. You're probably going to have to drop out of X, Y, and Z in order to do this. But we think you're the perfect person to do this. And I'm just telling you, pastors, if you will approach a couple folks in your congregation like that, God knows how to make churches. He's brought you the right people.
Yeah.
They're in your church, but you need to ask them in a way that would engage them and give them the chest to step up and get, puffed out chest going, okay, I can do this. That's the way leaders need to be approached.
Yeah. No, that's great. So where do you see connections? I mean, I think they're all through this discussion, but where do you
Yeah.
see some connections between, what you're really describing here and just, the Untapped Church, kind of another, plug for the book, but like, I really, you've really laid a lot of this out, but where do you see really the connection points between this biblical vision and,
Yeah.
what you've laid out there?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that, I told you a minute ago, I think my big regret was with the book was that we didn't go far enough,
Yeah.
that we didn't go outside the walls of the church. And I do think that is um, the next chapter, certainly for us, of the book's, foundation that it's laid. But I will say this, especially for, people who are interested in this subject, I do think that without the principles that are laid out in that book kind of laying the foundation, we wouldn't be able to do what we're thinking about doing next. And so I do think building that empowerment culture, that culture that says, the church is not a business, it's a body.
Yeah.
And so we a lot of us try to run our churches like businesses, and bodies are totally different things. And so when you're running a body, that means every part has a job to do. And, there's an interdependence that happens. And when one part of the body isn't functioning right, the rest of the body needs to rally to make sure that it's functioning right. And those things always don't line up with the bottom lines. And so I think there's this biblical concept of like, man, get the church activated, get the people of the church mobilized. And this idea that the pastors of the church are not the doers of ministry. The pastors of the church are empowerers of ministry, equippers of ministry, equip the saints for works of ministry. And so I look at a verse like that and go, man, if we're in church ministry and we're running around doing everything, we're actually not doing our job,
Yeah.
because our job is to equip the saints for works of ministry. And so anyway, these principles have laid the foundation for us to be able to now really try to extend that disciple making vision outside our walls, to where people live, work, learn, and play. And so really that's the connection. I'm looking at my ministry, and I'm 30 years in, but I'm looking at it going, Untapped Church was really kind of part one, but this, we're calling it reinventing church. Reinventing church is part two of going, what does it look like for the church to empower people outside the walls? And we're just trying to build our whole organization, our whole staff around what does it look like to come around people who are already doing ministry and pour gas on the fire.
I love that. I love that. So if there's someone that wanted to get more involved or learn more or just get in contact with you, what are some ways folks could connect with what you're doing at Grace and what you've done with Untapped Church?
Yeah, great. I'm on all the social medias. So, and I'm old enough to have all of the original things. And so it's my name, Derek Sanford, Derek, Sanford. So I'm on X and Facebook and LinkedIn and all those, mainly using Facebook and Instagram. And but I have a website, dereksanford.com. And at the website, people can get information about the book. There's tons of free resources there. I do an email newsletter from time to time, and so I just give away lots of stuff. I want to equip pastors, but also this new podcast that I just mentioned called Reinventing Church. We're a couple seasons into that. We've got another season coming up this fall that's really just chronicling our journey from moving from a megachurch model, attractional assimilation, to a missional multiplication. And we're just kind of giving updates as to how it's going and talking principles that we're trying to implement at the ground level. So that would be the best way to get in touch.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I'll include all those links down below. I know probably worth mentioning, I know it's not your main gig, but I know a number of times every year churches invite you to come out and do workshops to really help them think through that. That's another really powerful way I'm sure people can engage you. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so before we wrap up, I always love to ask the question, what's your favorite Nehemiah moment?
All right. So my tongue-in-cheek favorite verse that I talk about in some of our courses that we train is obviously 13:25, and I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. But I probably can't land on that one. I think this is
say I laid hands on them.
laid hands on them, which is fantastic. Yeah. I know it's probably a common response, but this passage, I'm doing a great work and I can't come down. Yeah. And as the wall's almost finished. Yeah. Wall's almost finished. Gates are the last piece, and the enemies that have been mocking and threatening, and they're not trying to distract him. And that line has carried me more through more than a few seasons of ministry, tough ministry and leadership, just because of the focus and the calling. And sometimes leadership comes down to just that. Just stay on the wall, man. Just stay on the wall.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Derek, thanks so much for being here today. Thanks so much for sharing your story. It's just really powerful. It's unconventional. And I believe transformational.
Yeah, thanks, John. I really appreciate the work you're doing too, brother. Keep it up.
All right. Thanks for being here.